They say travel opens your eyes to new worlds, but what happens when the world you visit sees you as an outsider in the worst way possible? Grant Bradley, a young white man with a passion for exploring the unknown, set out on a journey that would challenge his understanding of himself and humanity. What he discovered in South Africa wasn't just its breathtaking landscapes or vibrant culture. It was a side of life he had never experienced, one that would leave an indelible mark on his soul. This is not just a story about travel. It's about what happens when the tables turn in ways you could never expect. Grant Bradley was no stranger to adventure. At 29, he had traveled to over 15 countries, collecting stories, souvenirs, and snapshots of life that he would one day share with his future family. From trekking through the snowy peaks of the Alps to diving in the crystal-clear waters of the Maldives, every destination added a new chapter to his journey. But there was one corner of the world he had yet to explore: Africa. For Grant, Africa wasn't just a destination, it was a dream. The continent had always fascinated him with its diversity, history, and culture. But as much as he was drawn to it, he also carried an unspoken hesitation. Africa to him felt like stepping into a story he didn't fully understand, a story that was still being written. Sitting in his New York apartment one evening, Grant found himself scrolling through photos of the South African countryside. Vast savannas stretched to the horizon, dotted with acacia trees and roaming wildlife. The colorful streets of local markets seemed to pulse with energy. It was settled. He would visit Limpopo, a province rich in culture and history, before his 30th birthday. The weeks leading up to the trip were a whirlwind of planning. Grant combed through travel blogs, watched documentaries, and filled a notebook with everything he wanted to see and do. His friends teased him about how detailed he was, but Grant knew the value of preparation. This trip, he told himself, would be one for the books. When the day finally arrived, Grant could hardly contain his excitement. As he boarded the plane, he felt the familiar rush of anticipation that always accompanied his travels. The hum of the engines, the faint smell of coffee brewing in the galley, and the chatter of passengers around him all signaled the start of a new adventure. The descent into Limpopo was nothing short of mesmerizing. From his window seat, Grant watched as the plane cut through a blanket of clouds, revealing a patchwork of green fields, winding rivers, and small villages. The sunlight bathed the landscape in a golden glow, making everything look surreal. Stepping off the plane, the first thing Grant noticed was the air. It was warm and slightly humid, carrying the faint scent of earth and vegetation. The airport was smaller than what he was used to, but it buzzed with life. Travelers moved with purpose. Locals greeted each other with enthusiastic handshakes, and a faint rhythm of drums played somewhere in the distance. Grant made his way through customs, his curiosity piqued by every detail. The colorful clothing of the airport staff, the melodic accents in their speech, and the large murals depicting South African wildlife and culture. It all felt so alive, so different. But as he stepped into the arrivals hall, he noticed something else. A shift in the way people looked at him. Some stared openly, their expressions a mix of curiosity and something he couldn't quite place. Others avoided his gaze altogether. Grant felt a flicker of unease, but quickly brushed it aside. He told himself it was probably because he was a foreigner. At the taxi stand, the driver greeted him with a polite nod, but remained largely silent during the ride to the hotel. Grant didn't mind. He was too busy soaking in the sights. The city of Polokwane was a mix of contrasts. Modern buildings towered over narrow streets, lined with makeshift stalls, selling everything from fresh fruit to handcrafted jewelry. Children played soccer in open fields, while adults haggled over prices in the markets. When Grant arrived at his hotel, a modest but charming establishment on the outskirts of the city, he was greeted by a receptionist who barely acknowledged his presence. She was a middle-aged woman with sharp features and a piercing gaze. "Name?" she asked, her tone clipped and impersonal. "Grant Bradley," he replied, handing over his reservation details with a friendly smile. The woman glanced at the papers, then back at him. Her eyes lingered for a moment too long, scanning him as if she were trying to figure out what he was doing there. Without a word, she slid the key across the counter and turned her attention to the next guest. Grant stood there for a moment, unsure of what to make of the interaction. It wasn't outright hostility, but it wasn't welcoming either. He picked up his key and made his way to his room, his excitement slightly dampened. Inside the room, Grant unpacked his bags, trying to shake off the strange encounter. He reminded himself that not everyone would be warm and friendly, and that was okay. Maybe she's just having a bad day, he thought. As night fell, Grant sat by the window, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance. The streets below bustled with activity, and the sounds of laughter and music floated up to his room. He felt a twinge of excitement again. Tomorrow, his real adventure would begin. The first rays of sunlight filtered through the curtains as Grant woke up to the sounds of birds chirping outside his hotel room. Today was the day he would begin checking off the items on his to-do list, a meticulously crafted itinerary filled with everything he wanted to experience during his 2 weeks in Limpopo. Sitting at the small desk in his room, Grant went over his plans again. A morning safari to see the Big Five, an afternoon at the local cultural center to learn about traditional dances, and evenings exploring the vibrant street markets where he'd heard the food was unforgettable. Each day was packed, and he was eager to dive in. His excitement made him feel almost like a child again, wide-eyed and brimming with curiosity. He scribbled a note in his journal. Day 1, ready to explore. Africa, show me your magic. After a quick breakfast at the hotel, Grant headed to the bus stop. The streets were already bustling with life. Vendors were setting up their stalls, and locals moved with purpose, carrying bags of produce or chatting animatedly on their way to work. When the bus arrived, it was nearly full. As Grant stepped inside, the atmosphere shifted. Conversations softened, and a few heads turned to look at him. He noticed the mix of passengers, mostly locals, with a handful of tourists like himself scattered throughout. He scanned the seats and spotted an open spot beside a woman holding a small child. With a friendly nod, Grant made his way to the seat. But as soon as he sat down, the woman stiffened. She pulled her child closer to her chest, her expression hardening. "Come, baby," she said sharply, standing up and moving to another seat further down the aisle. Grant froze, stunned. The movement had been so deliberate, so pointed, that there was no mistaking her intent. The child's voice broke the silence. "Why are we moving, Mama?" The woman leaned down and whispered, her words meant to be discreet, but loud enough to reach Grant's ears. "We don't sit near them." Grant's cheeks burned with embarrassment. He looked around, hoping for some kind of reassurance, but the other passengers avoided his gaze. A few even exchanged knowing looks, as if silently agreeing with the woman's actions. For the rest of the ride, Grant sat alone, his mind racing. The humiliation lingered, gnawing at him. He had never felt so out of place, so judged, for something as simple as the color of his skin. Is this what people of color feel all the time? He wondered. The thought was sobering. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had just glimpsed a reality that was foreign to him, but all too familiar to others. Determined not to let the incident on the bus ruin his day, Grant pushed forward with his plans. After arriving at the tourist center, he joined a small group for a guided tour of the local village. The guide was friendly and knowledgeable, explaining the history and significance of the area's cultural landmarks. For a while, Grant felt himself relaxing. The beauty of the landscape, the intricate craftsmanship of the traditional huts, and the warmth of the children who waved as they passed by were enough to lift his spirits. But as the day went on, little things began to pile up. At one of the market stalls, Grant admired a carved wooden mask. The vendor smiled at first, but then quoted a price that seemed exorbitantly high. Grant hesitated, glancing at another customer, a local, who had just purchased a similar item for a fraction of the cost. "Is this the standard price?" Grant asked politely. The vendor's smile faded. "For you, yes," he said, his tone curt. Grant reluctantly paid, feeling both frustrated and taken advantage of. Later, as he wandered through the market, he noticed how people would subtly shift their bodies to avoid brushing past him. Some muttered words in their native language, their tones dismissive or even mocking. At one stall, when he reached out to examine a piece of jewelry, the vendor quickly snatched it away. "Not for you," she said, her voice flat. By the time Grant returned to his hotel that evening, he was mentally and emotionally drained. Sitting on the edge of his bed, he replayed the events of the day in his mind. Am I imagining this? He wondered. Maybe I'm just overthinking things. People have bad days, right? But deep down, he knew these weren't isolated incidents. There was a pattern, a subtle yet undeniable sense of exclusion, of being unwelcome. Grant opened his journal and began to write, his pen moving slower than usual. Today was harder than I expected. Africa is beautiful, but I can't shake the feeling that I don't belong here. Is this what it feels like to be judged before you even open your mouth? To have people make assumptions about who you are just by looking at you? He paused, staring at the words on the page. For the first time in his life, Grant began to understand what it meant to be on the other side of prejudice. After several days of exploring Limpopo, Grant decided he needed a break from the tourist sites and markets. That evening, he ventured into a lively part of the city known for its vibrant nightlife. The streets were illuminated by strings of colorful lights, and the sound of upbeat music spilled out from the bars and restaurants that lined the road. Grant found himself drawn to a small, rustic bar tucked away in an alley, its neon sign flickering faintly. Inside, the atmosphere was warm and inviting. The walls were adorned with local artwork, and the air was filled with laughter and the clinking of glasses. He struck up a conversation with a few other travelers and even tried some local drinks. For a moment, the tension of the past few days faded away. The rhythmic beats of the music and the easy camaraderie in the room reminded him of why he loved traveling so much: the chance to connect with people and immerse himself in new experiences. Hours passed, and the night deepened. By the time Grant decided to leave, the streets had quieted. The bustling energy from earlier was replaced by an eerie stillness, broken only by the occasional distant sound of a car engine. The route back to his hotel was a short walk through a dimly lit alley. As Grant strolled, the cool night air sobered him slightly, and he began to feel the weight of his solitude. Then, he heard footsteps behind him. At first, he brushed it off, thinking it was just another pedestrian. But the footsteps quickened, their rhythm deliberate and unsettling. Grant's heart began to race. He glanced over his shoulder and saw two men walking briskly toward him. "Hey, man," one of them called out, his tone sharp and mocking. "Where do you think you're going?" Grant stopped and turned to face them, his instincts telling him to stay calm. The men were young, probably in their late 20s, and their expressions were hard to read, somewhere between amusement and menace. "I'm just heading back to my hotel," Grant replied, his voice steady but his pulse pounding. The second man stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "You think you can just walk around here like you own the place?" Grant frowned, confused. "I don't understand." "You white people never do," the first man interrupted, his voice rising. "You come here, take what you want, and act like you're better than us. You probably see us as nothing but slaves, don't you?" Grant raised his hands defensively. "I don't think that at all. I'm just a tourist. I came here to learn about your culture." "Culture?" the second man spat, his tone dripping with disdain. "You think that makes you different? You're all the same." Before Grant could respond, the first man grabbed him by the collar and shoved him against the wall. The impact knocked the air out of his lungs, and his backpack fell to the ground with a thud. "Let's see what you've got," the man sneered, rifling through Grant's pockets. He pulled out Grant's wallet, phone, and a gold watch. "No, not the watch," Grant pleaded, his voice trembling. "It belonged to my father." The second man smirked, holding the watch up to the faint light. "Your daddy's watch, huh? Maybe this will teach you what it feels like to lose something that matters." Grant's chest tightened as he watched them pocket his belongings. He felt a surge of anger, but it was quickly replaced by fear when the first man shoved him again, harder this time. "Here's a tip," the man said, leaning in close. "Don't come back. You're not welcome here." With one final push, they sent Grant sprawling onto the ground. The sharp sting of his palms scraping against the pavement was nothing compared to the humiliation and fear that coursed through him. The two men disappeared into the shadows, their laughter echoing down the alley. For a moment, Grant lay there, stunned. His heart pounded in his ears, and his breathing came in short, ragged gasps. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on him, both physically and emotionally. As he stumbled toward the main road, He couldn't shake the words of the men from his mind. Their accusations, their anger, it all felt personal, but he couldn't understand why. The streets were eerily quiet as Grant stumbled toward the faint glow of a small police station sign. The night's events replayed in his mind, each moment more surreal than the last. His hands trembled, bloodied from the fall, and his breath came in short gasps. The once vivid excitement of being in Limpopo had been replaced by a gnawing fear and disbelief. The police station was modest, with flickering fluorescent lights illuminating its worn facade. Inside, the air was stale and heavy, and the quiet murmur of voices fell silent as Grant stepped in. His disheveled appearance drew immediate glances from the officers inside. He approached the front desk, gripping it for support as he tried to steady his voice. "I was just robbed," he managed to say, his words shaky but urgent. "Two men. They attacked me in an alley. They took everything, my wallet, my phone, my father's watch." The officer behind the desk, a stocky man with tired eyes, barely looked up from his paperwork. His expression was indifferent, almost bored. "This isn't America," the officer said flatly, not bothering to hide the edge in his voice. "You can't just come here and expect us to jump because you say so." Grant blinked, stunned by the response. "I'm not expecting anything. I'm asking for help. I was attacked." Another officer nearby, younger and leaning casually against the wall, smirked as he chimed in. "What's the matter, white man? Can't handle a little reality? Welcome to Africa." The room filled with low chuckles, the kind that made Grant's stomach churn. He stood there, feeling exposed and helpless, the weight of their indifference pressing down on him. For a moment, he didn't know what to say. He had never been treated this way before, dismissed, mocked, and made to feel as though his pain was irrelevant. "I never imagined feeling this helpless," he thought, his mind racing. This was the kind of story he had read about in articles or seen in movies, but experiencing it firsthand was something entirely different. Just as Grant began to wonder if he should leave, a voice cut through the tension like a blade. "That's enough." The room fell silent as everyone turned toward the doorway. Standing there was an older man with a commanding presence. His uniform was impeccably pressed, and his eyes were sharp and piercing, taking in the scene with a quiet intensity. "Commissioner Mabuza," one of the officers mumbled, suddenly straightening. Mabuza stepped forward, his gaze sweeping over the room before landing on Grant. For a moment, he said nothing, simply studying him. Then, in a firm but measured tone, he said, "Follow me." Grant hesitated, but followed the commissioner into a small office at the back of the station. The room was sparse, with a wooden desk, a few chairs, and a map of Limpopo pinned to the wall. The faint hum of a fan filled the silence as Mabuza gestured for Grant to sit. "Tell me what happened," the commissioner said, his tone steady but with an edge of curiosity. Grant recounted the attack, his voice trembling as he described the two men, their accusations, and how they had taken everything, including his father's watch. As he spoke, Mabuza listened intently, his face unreadable. When Grant finished, the commissioner leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled. "What happened to you is unacceptable," he said, his voice calm but resolute. "But I won't lie to you. This won't be easy. Many people in this community carry deep scars from our past. Some use those scars as an excuse to lash out, to blame others for their pain." Grant swallowed hard, unsure of how to respond. "But," Mabuza continued, his eyes meeting Grant's, "violence and theft are not the answer to anything. What those men did to you was wrong, and I will make sure we do everything we can to find them." Grant felt a flicker of hope at the commissioner's words, though his doubts lingered. Mabuza stood and crossed his arms, his expression softening slightly. "I've lived through apartheid, seen its worst, and worked my whole life to build a country where justice is more than just a word. I understand what it's like to feel powerless, but no one is above or beneath the law. Justice must be served for everyone." For the first time that night, Grant felt a sense of relief. It wasn't overwhelming, but it was enough to keep him from breaking down completely. As the commissioner called his officers into action, Grant sat back in the chair, his mind still racing, but his heart a little steadier. This was far from over, but at least now he wasn't completely alone. 3 days after the robbery, Grant received a call from Commissioner Mabuza. The suspects had been apprehended, and he was invited to the station to identify them. As he walked through the station's halls, a mix of emotions coursed through him: relief, anger, and a lingering sense of fear. Inside a small, dimly lit room, Grant stood behind a one-way mirror. On the other side sat the two men who had attacked him. They were shackled to the metal table, their faces hardened with defiance. The younger of the two had a scar running down his cheek, while the older man's sunken eyes betrayed a weariness far beyond his years. "That's them," Grant said quietly. Later, Mabuza called him into his office, where the interrogation of the two men had begun. Grant wasn't allowed in the room, but he could hear everything from where he sat just outside the door. "You've got some nerve," the first man, who called himself Themba, sneered. "Arresting us for what? For doing what's right." "What's right?" Mabuza's voice was calm but firm. "You call robbing and assaulting a man justice?" "Justice?" Themba spat. "You want to talk about justice? Our ancestors were treated like animals by people like him." There was silence for a moment before the second man, Sifo, spoke, his voice low and bitter. "My grandfather was born into slavery. My father grew up under apartheid. They lived and died knowing they were nothing in the eyes of men who looked like him. Do you know what that does to a person?" Mabuza remained silent, letting the men speak. "The world hasn't changed," Sifo continued, his voice trembling with emotion. "We're still nothing. We live in shacks, while people like him walk into our country and live like kings. Taking from him, that was the only way we could take something back." Through the open door, Grant could hear every word. His heart sank as the men's voices rose, their words dripping with anger and pain. He had never considered what it might feel like to live with such a deep generational wound. Themba's voice interrupted his thoughts. "You know we're right," he said, his tone almost daring. "You've lived through it too. You know what this place does to people like us." Grant glanced at Mabuza, who stood in the doorway, his face a mixture of sternness and something else, maybe empathy, maybe fatigue. "I know the pain you're carrying," Mabuza said after a pause. "But the moment you use that pain to hurt someone else, you become part of the same cycle that oppressed your family. Justice isn't vengeance." The ride back to his hotel that evening was quiet. Grant sat in the back seat of the taxi, staring out at the city lights, his mind replaying everything he'd heard. Themba and Sifo's words lingered in his thoughts like a heavy fog. Back in his room, he sat on the edge of his bed, holding his travel journal. The pages that once reflected excitement and curiosity now seemed hollow. He thought about his life in New York, his comfortable apartment, his steady job, his easy ability to move through the world without worrying about how people perceived him. And then he thought about the men in that interrogation room. "I've always thought of myself as open-minded," he wrote in his journal. "I've donated to charities, I've read books about inequality, but maybe I didn't truly understand what racism feels like until now. Until I was the one being judged, the one being targeted." His pen hovered over the page as flashbacks filled his mind, moments when he had seen injustice back home but had done nothing. The homeless black man on the subway who was ignored by everyone, including Grant. The jokes his coworkers made about immigrants that he laughed at, not because they were funny, but because he didn't want to seem uptight. "I thought I was different," he whispered to himself, the words heavy with guilt. The next morning, Grant wandered into the hotel's cafe, craving coffee but mostly needing a moment to clear his head. As he waited for his order, a voice broke through his thoughts. "Rough night?" He turned to see a woman standing beside him. She was in her late 30s, with a kind face and an air of quiet strength. "Something like that," Grant replied, managing a weak smile. The woman introduced herself as Lindiwe, a local artist who often stopped by the cafe to sketch. The two struck up a conversation, and before long, Grant found himself sharing bits of his story, not just the attack, but the feelings it had stirred in him. Lindiwe listened intently, nodding as he spoke. Then she began to share her own story. "My family lived through apartheid," she said, her voice steady but laced with emotion. "My parents couldn't go to certain schools, couldn't live in certain neighborhoods, couldn't even walk down certain streets without being harassed. That kind of pain doesn't just disappear, it lingers, passing from one generation to the next." Grant leaned in, hanging on her every word. "But here's the thing," Lindiwe continued. Pain doesn't justify hate. If we let it, we'll never move forward. It's not easy, but forgiveness is the only way to heal. Her words struck a chord deep within Grant. For the first time, he began to see the complexities of the situation, not just his own pain, but the pain that drove others to act out in anger. Over the next few days, Lindiwe became a guide of sorts, helping Grant navigate the city and its history. She took him to museums that chronicled South Africa's past, to neighborhoods that bore the scars of apartheid, and to community centers where people worked tirelessly to build a better future. Through her, Grant began to understand that his experience, while painful, was just one piece of a much larger story. And though the scars of racism ran deep, so did the resilience and hope of those who fought against it. Here brings us to the end of Grant's journey, at least for now. Grant's time in Limpopo became more than just a trip to check off his bucket list. It was an awakening, a journey through the depths of human pain, anger, and resilience. He came to Africa expecting adventure, but he left with a perspective he never anticipated. A deeper understanding of the complexities of racism and the scars left behind by history. But this story doesn't end here. Justice was promised, but what happens next? Will the robbers face the consequences of their actions, or will deeper truths about their motives emerge? And how will Grant's experience shape the way he lives his life back in New York? If you want to see what happens in the next chapter of Grant's journey, both in South Africa and beyond, let us know in the comments below. Do you think Grant should forgive the men who attacked him, or should he push for them to face the full force of the law? And how do you think this experience will change the way he views the world? Share your thoughts below. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. There's so much more to come, stories that challenge the way we see the world and each other. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.